Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see you folks out there this evening for our, what is this? I think our 8th episode now of Monday
It's
Night Monsters.
it's moving on, my friend. It's moving on. We are becoming seasoned veterans at this point.
Exactly. If we just got to figure out what buttons to push and we'll be good to go.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, but I'm looking forward today. Every Monday, as soon as I get Chris on my screen, I thought there's no better time to be had than this. And I'm excited about our topic tonight as well, too.
I am very much too. As a matter of fact, tonight's topic, once again, was suggested by one of our viewers. In this case, I think it was Mary Beth who suggested the idea of zombies. And so we decided that that was a really fun concept. And a couple of people were bandying that idea around in the comments last week. So very excited to tackle a complicated topic, much more complicated than I ever anticipated it was.
Yeah, complicated, but very popular as well, too.
It really certainly is. And in fact, it's funny because, as I mentioned, we were talking a little bit about this last week, is that every time we do one of these new shows, there's a lot of learning involved. I mean, we're not coming into this as complete experts in every one of these topics. And so it's really fun sometimes to learn the down dirty nitty gritty and some of the really interesting origins of some of these creatures. And I've actually found this week that zombies probably one of the most complex and convoluted origins in maybe all of monster folklore. So I'm very much looking forward to tonight's show.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you, as far as monsters go, do zombies scare you?
In a sense, they do. I would say that zombies scare me much the same way that I think I told y'all a few weeks ago when we did our Frankenstein show, that the idea of this relentless, slow-moving, mindless killer has always been a very frightening idea. That's why Frankenstein, zombies, sharks, things that are these like mindless eating machines, well, not that Frankenstein's an eating machine, but you know what I'm saying, have always, even like Michael Myers from the Halloween movies, these kind of killers seem to me to be always very frightening because I like to think of myself as an intellectual person, and I always tell myself, well, hello, Joe, nice to see you. Mary Beth, nice to see you back. One of the things that's always occurred to me is whenever I watch a monster movie, a horror movie, I've always thought, I'm a smart guy. I can outwit some kind of a crazed killer or a psychopath or figure out how to get away from a werewolf. But these relentless, mindless killers, they just seem inescapable. So yes, I've always found that idea very terrifying.
See, of all monsters, these frightened me the most because whenever I was a child, Night of the Living Dead was just making its rounds. Okay, I think Night of the Living Dead, if I'm not mistaken, was filmed in like about '68. Is that right?
Yeah, it was 1968. It was released, filmed in 1967. Exactly.
Yeah,
we're going to talk about that actually a little bit tonight because it was a very important film.
Sure, absolutely. But what scared me is because by the mid 70s, it starts appearing on late night television. Okay. And because I'm from very local to where it was filmed at, it was filmed outside of Pittsburgh. So I was in a little town west of Pittsburgh or east of Pittsburgh. East of Pittsburgh. And on Night of the Living Dead, on the television screen that they were watching to go to for any kind of assistance or any kind of word about this invasion going on by zombies. My hometown was actually on the scroll line below there. So as a kid, seeing my hometown on that TV screen, it made it feel so alive. So ever since that time, I think the one monster that I'm most fearful of is a zombie. So I'm looking at this as a kind of cathartic experience to kind of exercise some demons. So I can't wait to rock and roll.
All right. So something I want to kind of start with is sort of a monumental event in the sort of the realm of monsterdom. Hello, Pepper. Welcome aboard. That occurred about 25 years ago and sort of rocked the world. And that was a film that really kind of changed the landscape of horror. That film was Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island. Now, of course, I'm sure a lot of us grew up watching Scooby-Doo. Some of you younger folks, have seen the newer versions. I grew up in the 1960s and 70s and loved the original show. And one thing you could always guarantee at the end of every Scooby-Doo episode is they would unmask the monster and prove that it was an insurance scam or a land grift or something like that. And Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island, which came out in 1998, features a really, really good scene in which Fred, of course, the leader of the group, goes to unmask one of these zombies that are terrorizing this remote island and finds that the mask doesn't come off because it is a true, honest-to-God zombie. This was the very first time in Scooby-Doo canon that the the monsters actually turned out to be genuinely supernatural. And the thing about this is that it has kind of carried over through Scooby-Doo ever since. And I think that is for a lot of kids in that generation was the beginning of a fascination. There's so many kids who tell sort of nostalgic stories about Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island. It's still a massively popular cult film, even among adults. And so that kind of gives you an idea of just how saturated the zombie idea is in popular culture, is that it even actually influences kids programming, children's
Right.
programming, and kind of carries through to adults. And so that's something I think we're going to talk a lot about tonight, is how culturally important and influential the zombie myth has become.
Right. Yeah. So I'm a connoisseur of Scooby Doo. Love myself some Scooby. Whenever I saw Zombie Island, and I was in my 30s by this time, I thought this would be equivalent to what the Elizabethans were looking at whenever they watched Hamlet for the first time. This is the pinnacle. This is the pinnacle of anything that could be possible in Scooby-Doo. If you have not watched it, folks, go out there and see it. It's about an 80-minute runtime or something like that, but it's unbelievable. And I will tell you this: I'm going to let you down a little bit here. Did you know there's a Return to Zombie Island?
I know there is. I kind of afraid to watch it because I couldn't imagine it could be as good as the original.
My friend, it is very sad. It is very sad. So we won't discuss that. But yes, you've hit that proverbial nail on the head yet again. So what is going on is that, as you said, it permeates our culture, correct? So as the adults are getting ready to jump on the bandwagon of The Walking Dead, now the children have this little thing to deal with as well too. And we'll discuss this later. But it also has to do a lot with the culture and the time in which these things are taking place as well.
And by the way, we just had a ticker on the screen a moment ago about the folks from Dark Zone who may be joining us tonight. Of course, we're really happy to have you guys on board. We've now, this is, I think, our second week broadcasting on the Dark Zone network. And so you folks listening out there, we are absolutely thrilled to have you aboard as well. And if you want to visit us on Dead Air Full Spectrum on YouTube and subscribe to us, we have this show every single week. And so very, very glad to have you guys aboard. Now, I want to say something, which is that, of course, it's fun to start with Scooby-Doo because Scooby-Doo is a great sort of a kid-friendly show, but that obviously does not encompass all of zombiedom. And there's a much, much darker side to the lore of the zombie. And I think one of the most affecting lines I've ever heard in a film came in the 1978 film, which we're also going to talk a little bit more in depth about a little bit later on, which is Dawn of the Dead. And there's an amazing line in that movie when one of the characters says, "When there's no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth." And I remember finding that incredibly terrifying. And it's already a very scary film, but it kind of, again, encompasses, you've got the two sides. You've got the funny, moaning, sort of stumbling zombies, but you also have this idea of the resurrected dead, flesh-eating creatures rising from the grave. And the idea that if that ever happened, how absolutely terrifying it would be is probably one of the things that is most terrifying about zombies. Is there's never a zombie. It's always a horde of zombies. And that's why these films can be so terrifying. I think really in many ways, they're one of the most believable and one of the most realistic monsters in the canon of sort of horror, because zombies are often supernatural in these films, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they are a natural phenomena. Sometimes it's just people that are subjected to, a drug or radiation, or there's all sorts of explanations, but it does make them feel more realistic. And because we've actually experienced things that are quite similar to these zombie uprisings in a variety of ways. And that's something we're going to get into this evening as well. I think it still really strikes a chord and terrifies us.
It does. Even the CDC, have used zombies part of their promotional campaigns or propaganda campaigns, if you will, in order to look about, for vaccinations and everything else, because there is that fear out there that something could unleash itself on mankind and turn us into these kind of mindless creatures. So that's still very current with us even to this day in this, 21st century, full of medicine, what is this supernatural, superstitious stuff that nobody pays any attention to. But a lot of people are really taking this into account.
Now, one thing I think that almost everyone will agree on is that a zombie, the way we see them today, is pretty much a standardized, a standardized concept. A zombie is generally, they can be slow, they can be fast, they can be shambling, but basically they are a living corpse, living corpses who rise up en masse and generally have a taste for flesh. And this, as I say, is a very, very terrifying concept. And in fact, it's something that has a strange appeal in popular culture. When you think about the fact that, what was it, AMC's show, The Walking Dead, lasted for how many seasons? I never imagined that that would happen, that a televised, fairly gruesome television series based on zombies could actually carry, I think it was 7 or 8 seasons. And to me, that's absolutely remarkable. And it
I think
does
it's still
go.
going, isn't it? I don't think
I
it's
think
wrong.
there are spin-offs that are still on. I don't know if the
Yeah.
original show is on, but I know that there've been a couple of different spin-offs from it. And certainly, again, the idea that this show has had such staying power really, really shows us how culturally embedded zombies are. But the thing about zombies is that, much like many of the monsters that we've covered over the course of the last couple of months here on Monday Night Monsters, when you think of a zombie, you're not thinking of the zombies that used to exist in folklore. The modern zombie that we know today, the shambling corpse, the flesh-eating zombie, is a modern invention, and it is an invention of cinema. And to get to the actual origin of zombies, we actually have to wind the clock back about 400 years, give or take, to the early colonization of the New World. In the 1500s, in the mid 1500s, the French began to colonize the islands of the Caribbean, including the island of San Domingo, which would come to be known later as Haiti. And they were bringing slaves. They were bringing captured African slaves from a variety of different cultures and installing them in the plantations there, because they had sugar cane and they had tobacco and all these great crops, and not enough voluntary labor to harvest these things. So instead, they enslaved Africans. And this was the really big beginning. This is where the ball really got rolling with the Western and Atlantic slave trade. So a very, very dark time in Western history. But it was here in Haiti that really the origin of the zombie began. Now, last week when we were then some folks in the comments were bandying about the idea of doing zombies. I noticed there were a couple of people who mentioned the practice of what was known as voodoo, and said that voodoo was very frightening. And that's something I actually think we want to address tonight, because it does have a huge connection to the zombie mythology. And so I'll throw up a quick graphic here about the origins of what we today in the US call voodoo. So when these Africans were brought to the New World and brought to islands like Haiti or San Domingo, they were not all from one tribe. They were from many, many different tribes all across West Africa, and they had different beliefs, and they had different cultures and even different languages. But together here in the New World and enslaved, living very, very hard lives, most of these slaves had much more in common with one another than they ever would with the white people who had enslaved them. And so they bonded together and created a new religion, a religion that amalgamated many of their old beliefs and many of their old gods. And that was the religion that first came to be known as Vodou, or voodoo, as we have vulgarized it here in the US when cities like New Orleans started to flourish. But this is really where we start to find the origin of some of the mythology that would end up evolving into the zombie that we know today.
There's a bit of a dualism within that religion as well, too, and you can see that brought in by the accessibility of Catholicism in there as well, too. So the idea of a zombie within that religion, within that religion, within the context, could be one that's very physical or one that's spiritual as well, too. So you could almost think of a zombie as a hollowed out human form with no soul in it, or the soul that does not have a body with it as well, too. So it gets even more complicated than that. We could talk about, the idea of zombies within the voodoo tradition, but it even goes deeper than that as well.
It does. Now, one of the things that the enslaved Africans brought with them were their gods, and their gods over the different tribes took on a variety of forms, but some of the more well known as that it evolved into the Caribbean versions of their religion, where Agwe was a water god, Erzuli a goddess of love, there was Asaka, the great earth mother, and then this sort of almost shape shifting trickster like god of death that was known in different versions as Gede, Papa Gay, and one that some people are probably familiar with, which is Baron Samedi. Baron Samedi being a very, very popular image in sort of modern interpretations of Voodoo. If anyone has even seen like the Disney film The Princess and the Frog, there's a Dr. Facili, I believe his name is, who is dressed in the garb of this death god. He's sort of the voodoo version of the Grim Reaper. Now, in order to perform the magic, and of course it was a very magical religion, as many pagan religions are, they would draw these elaborate and often, I think, very beautiful sigils called veve. And they were drawn with cornstarch. And if you've ever seen even films about Santeria, voodoo, or any of the other religions that evolved from it, you've often seen circles and images drawn like this. And this was the way that they would capture the attention of the Loa, these spirit gods, and have them do their bidding, whether it was that they wanted a love spell and needed to sort of capture Erzuli's attention, or to have their crops grow, so they wanted Asaka's protection, the earth goddess, or to stop a flood and speak to Agwe. The Papa Gay was the darkest of the Loa, and he was the god of death. He was the master of the underworld, and so in every way, effectively the master of zombies.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, and again, like I said, we can start connecting the dots as well too. It starts sounding a little bit like the golem that we had dealt with a little bit ago as well. The idea that you can put a spell on something and then make it do your bidding. So we can see across cultures this idea, these archetypes, how developed within the human psyche that continue in so many different directions.
Very much. Now, one of the reasons I think that the zombie concept actually became important to these people is that the Haitian Africans believed, and this was something that they'd carried over from their home religions, is that the soul had essentially two components, or rather that life had two components. There were two. There was I think they called it the Tibon Ang, which was the actual soul. That was your spirit. That was the part of you that had your personality, that actually animated you. And the Gros Bon Ang, which was your physical body. But your physical body, without the Tibon Ang within it, once the soul had departed, wasn't actually dead. It was simply a mass of instinct and a mass of base needs. So it was almost animalistic. And the idea was that a witch, or what they called a bokor, could capture the Tibon Ang, could capture the soul in a bottle, and in doing so, control what remained. And that what remained was the physical body. But this physical body now, which had the strength of the original, and it had the physical abilities, but no will of its own, could be enslaved and actually made into a worker. And so this was actually often done by Africans against other African tribes. And this is something that is an unfortunate truth, is that there was a sense of survival, and every person for themselves. But there's a lot of records that this actually happened in some way. And so supernatural, some kind of a natural phenomena, but the actual existence of these zombie workers is something that ended up being reported, over the years by many, many people. And so there's actually maybe some truth to it. I think this evening, one of the things we will do is address what the possible causes of that might have been.
Right. Yeah, I think that would be a good idea because people suggested certain types of psychedelic drugs and the idea of brainwashing as well too. So yeah, let's explore a little bit of that.
By the way, I actually had hunted for some pictures of these soul bottles that the Bokor would keep these in. And I also want to point something out. This is something very, very important to talk about as we talk about voodoo, and the religions that evolved from it among African descended people, both in the Caribbean islands and in the United States in later years, is that because, as I say, some of our audience were talking about being frightened by this later, is that like anything, it is not a black or white religion. And I don't mean that in a racial way. I mean that it's not simply good or evil. There are principles of good and evil in every aspect of life. And if there's one thing that is very true of Vodun, is that many of the people who practice this religion are positive, they're healers, and it's a religion with a great deal of beauty, a great deal of reverence for life. And the darker side of it exists, but that exists everywhere. That exists in every religion. And even though we may think that our Western religions, our monotheistic religions are exclusively good, there are dark figures, there are dark characters, and there are people who explore the dark side of that. Vodun is not an evil faith. It's not a faith that is dedicated to evil, but it can be like anything else. It can be turned to evil. And this is where, unfortunately, the zombie comes in.
Yeah, and taking this also in a cultural perspective, because of course that it came from a tradition that's based upon African beliefs, you get the idea of devil worshiping going on because, of course, it now becomes savage, right? So this is a very racial epitaph that we put upon things that we simply do not understand. Also, we have to look at the dark side of voodoo as it enters into the American vernacular, into North American vernacular. It's quite probable the reason why they focus so much on the dark side is because that's the way their life was so becoming. The beauty was fading away, and now they had to deal with enslavement in a place that was very, very foreign to them. So, of course, these kind of dark areas are going to rise up and take a prominent position because their lives weren't all that fantastic.
No, and the thing is that when a person is pushed into a corner, when a person is has everything of value stripped away from them, when even your children can be taken away and sold,
Mm.
the idea of a moral compass starts to become, it's a much harder thing to maintain. And
Right.
so, in order to trade in what we call black magic, and it's not, black magic's not meant to be a racial reference, but certainly the magic of these black African people delved into these very dark areas, and often it was magic of vengeance, it was magic of control, in order to try to regain some of that control over the lives, because they had almost every bit of control ripped away from them. So the idea that they would sort of take these extreme magical actions in order to control people, control others, to get what they needed, it's not unrealistic, and it certainly didn't make them bad people. It just made them desperate people trying their best to survive in a very, very harsh world.
Absolutely. But I think the commentary to be made here, though, again, is their religion, something that was very sacred to them, now becomes witchcraft in our language. Correct? I mean, when we look at the up in Salem, right? Tituba, right, was the progeny. Yeah, she's the one who started the witch trial hysterics up there because of her evil doings.
Exactly. Yeah, for
Yeah.
those of you who aren't not familiar with Tituba, she was believed to be a Haitian or Caribbean woman enslaved, and actually in the Salem settlement in 1692, when all of the witch trials and the witch hysteria in Salem started to break out. And according to, I believe, most reports, she was a slave in the house of I think it was the Parrish family,
I believe it
and
was. Yeah.
the daughter of the Bishop Paris actually um, uh, basically started learning little charms and spells from Tituba. She was teaching them little spells. She was teaching them simple incantations, things that were part of her culture that
Right,
she
love
considered.
spells, things like that, very innocuous things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but because the Puritans in Salem were so religiously strict and had such strictures against what they considered to be witchcraft, when the girls were discovered practicing these spells, they panicked, feeling that they were going to get in trouble, and immediately they immediately pointed the finger at Tituba and said she forced us to do these things. She used her black magic against us, and actually, it compelled them to perform these things. And of course, the people of Salem, instead of just saying, well, whatever, and firing Tituba or sending her back to Jamaica, instead they assumed that this was some terrible conspiracy of witches, and they wanted to know who else was involved, and it just grew and grew out of hand. So this was all part of the way early Americans. This was in the 1600s, before we even really understood anything of what Caribbean culture was like. So yeah, it's something that there is a great deal of ingrained racism in our fear of these religions. There's it was I think it was around World War II that, I'm sorry, I apologize, World War One, about 1915 or so, that we actually occupied Haiti for the first time, and some of the U.S. soldiers can be really credited with bringing the concept of the zombie, which we at this point really had never heard of here in the the US or in the Western world, bringing it here to the continental states and kind of beginning to create what we would consider the start of the horror of zombie folklore. And one of the first films that came out on that topic was called White Zombie. And at this point, the idea of Black culture was already exotic in a frightening way and considered, as you mentioned before, it was a perfect word, they were considered to be savages. And so, interestingly enough, in the film White Zombie, which came out in 1932, just a year after Bela Lugosi starred in Dracula, he starred as the Bokor, the witch doctor in this film. Interestingly enough, however, all of these characters were essentially white characters who were co-opting the religion of the Haitian people. But even in that case, you have so much racism involved because they were stealing the religious or the magical practices of the people of Haiti and then using them for evil. So ultimately, it was still sort of pointing the finger at Black Haitians as the origin of this evil, even with almost entirely white people performing the sort of the malefic actions.
Absolutely. We talked about this last week too, about the idea of the appropriation of cultures by people. Now think about this on a large scale whenever we're talking about a motion picture. And they literally did take a cultural identity, a cultural religion, strip it of all of its soul. And at the end, you do have a veritable zombie on film, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I think that one of the most fascinating Western explorations of the Haitian traditions, Haitian voodoo traditions, the Haitian zombie traditions, is a film that some of you may have seen. A fascinating film based on a book called The Serpent and the Rainbow. Serpent and the Rainbow, I think it was mid 1990s, if I remember correctly. I apologize, I don't recall the actual year that it came out. But directed by Wes Craven, a known horror director, but based on a book which was not a novel. The book was a nonfiction exploration of an anthropologist who went to Haiti in search of the drug that he believed was being used by the people there to create zombies. There were reports, as I say, coming back and had been for many years of people who were buried and then dug up and enslaved, even in the 20th century. And so this anthropologist went there in search of the chemical that could potentially be used for this sort of thing and ended up coming up with one of the probably most fascinating theories. Now, this is still a theory to this day. It's not proven, but I actually think it is truly fascinating, which is that tetrodotoxin. Tetrodotoxin is derived from pufferfish, and it is an incredibly powerful neurotoxin. And what tetrodotoxin does is it inhibits the ability of the brain to send signals to your nervous system. And so you can't physically move, you can't speak, you can't do anything. In fact, it actually suppresses the ability even for your heart and your lungs to work. But it slows it down to such an extraordinary degree that it actually mimics the appearance of death and puts you into a coma-like state. And this is all true. This is an absolute fact that this happens. What's theoretical still at this point is the idea that tetrodotoxin is the explanation for what these Bokor, these witch doctors, would use to create zombies. But it was believed that if a person became a victim or a target of one of these Bokors, whether by crossing somebody, the Bokor was paid to take somebody out of the picture, that they would find a way to poison this individual with the pufferfish venom, and that there was apparently supposed to be a reagent that actually would awaken them as well. But because they would appear to be dead, their families would bury them. Apparently, and there must be some truth to this, but apparently the embalming process wasn't a big part of what they did. They would just wrap the people up, put them in coffins, and put them in the ground. That may be something to do with the religious tradition. But upon digging them up, not only were they apparently restored to life, but this is the part where it becomes very fascinating, because the Haitian belief in this zombification process was so culturally ingrained, the people who return to life believe that their soul has been captured and therefore become unwilling and yet compliant slaves to the Bokor. So there is, as you said, you use the word brainwashing. You have drugs, brainwashing. Sort of an gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? A death-like state that's been artificially created, and in doing so, actually created these people. And there were times that these dead people would suddenly be seen in the streets by their own loved ones and would act as though they didn't even recognize them. So it is a terrifying, absolutely terrifying potential reality. Now, there is some folklore in this. We don't have absolute proof that this happened. This is something that was reported by this gentleman. I think his name was Wade Davis, if I'm not who wrote the book The Serpent and the Rainbow. But to me, that is absolutely fascinating because, again, you're getting to the core of an actual physical process that created something that would have created the original zombie idea.
And as we go on further this evening, my friend, we're going to see that some drugs are still to blame for certain types of zombie behavior that we witness around the world.
Unfortunately, this is all too true, and I think that culturally speaking, maybe actually contributes to some of our fear of the zombie idea. By the way, as we had discussed earlier, one of the things about the early zombie films is that they very much traded on the fear of Black culture. They traded on the fear of the other, the fear of Africans, and believing that they were that they had some magic at their disposal, which they would use against white people. And so, still, you have a great deal of ingrained racism, and this, of course, from some of those early films, these images being from the film I Walked with a Zombie, which was probably the first to show a Black zombie in much the same way that similar to the way we see zombies today.
Right. But we have to point out though too that these are Black male zombies that are terrifying white women. That's almost the trope of this.
Absolutely, and it's the idea that again, the savagery and the animalness and the idea was so easy to sort of impose on people's psyches because they already had these ingrained fears. I think probably after the Civil War, when slavery was officially abolished, it's clear enough that we were hardly ready to let the Africans, just be completely free. There were a lot of ways in which we kept Africans enslaved after that time, but the idea of the Africans being free to do as they will was terrifying to sort of genteel white people who believed all of these old terrible stories and believed that we were allowing savages to roam free. And unfortunately, that ingrained racism. And I know we're being a little bit woke here tonight, folks. Get over it, But that ingrained racism, unfortunately, is something that was a big part of culture at that time.
You have to look at these, as I like to say, that history does not exist in a vacuum. So whenever these movies are coming out, the reason they're coming out is because there's an audience for them, right? That's how entertainment works.
Absolutely.
And at a time whenever segregation was still part of this world, at a time whenever it was still us versus them, and they were still the outsiders. This is the culture that made these movies acceptable.
It is. Now, I think it's fascinating where things went from there. So in the 1930s and then in the early 1940s, you had films like White Zombie and I Walked with a Zombie, and these all used the Haitian zombie concept. The sort of, they weren't walking corpses, they weren't eating people, they were basically magically enslaved people. That were the victims of some kind of African magic. And so again, traded a great deal on racism, but they were maintaining the African concept. And this largely came about, as I said, because of the reports that were coming back from soldiers in Haiti and people in Haiti around the time of the First World War, and actually ended up being the subject of a couple of books. There were nonfiction books as well as magazines and pulp novels that were actually trading on this idea, because it was an exotic and scary idea. So it was a very, very popular thing. But something happened in the 1960s that completely changed the landscape of zombie folklore forever and continues to do so today. And actually, two things happened. The first was the civil rights movement. And the second was the introduction of a film we've already talked about just a little bit, which is in 1968. It was the film Night of the Living Dead. Now, Night of the Living Dead remains today one of the most well-known and one of the most well-respected zombie films ever made. But it's really important to note that they didn't call it, not in the script or in the film at any time, where the creatures, these undead shambling monsters in the film, were never referred to as zombies. In fact, the creator of the film, the writer of the screenplay, George Romero, is the director. Actually, I believe John Russo wrote the screenplay, but George Romero, the director of the film, didn't know anything we are told, about Haitian zombie lore and wasn't trying to create that at all. He wanted this idea of these sort of resurrected dead people who were hungry for flesh. And the truth is that in a lot of ways, this was a zombie the way we see it today, but a zombie that was carried over not from Haitian folklore, but from European folklore. We have in European folklore some creatures that behave much more the way we see zombies today. Creatures like the ghoul. Ghoul comes from actually Arabic mythology. Arabic mythology, it was this demonic creature, but very, very humanoid in appearance, often looked like a corpse, but would haunt cemeteries and actually dig up and consume dead bodies. And another, probably more recognizable to European audiences, was the Revenant. And the Revenant was very much a cousin of the vampire. The Revenant was an animated corpse that was still driven, even in death, by its human needs. And so they would rise from death to satisfy hunger, lust, or a desire for revenge, and so would end up shambling around as a walking corpse, but going about whatever business that was unfinished in life. And so these are the creatures, I think, that influenced George Romero when he created the idea of the monsters, the beasts from his movie, The Night of the Living Dead.
Absolutely. I know I've had the opportunity to interview George Romero one time whenever I was in college.
Wow.
And you know what he called, what he referred to as his creatures as Night of the Living Dead?
I think he did use the word ghoul, didn't he?
Well, that's exactly right. That's what he used.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea of zombie was kind of thrust upon them at that time because we were dealing with the undead, but now we have shaped these things in our own image, right? We use the word appropriation again. What we've done, we've taken something out of one culture that's slightly similar to what we're dealing with here and create our own. So the Haitian zombie that we had, from which these things derived from, no longer exists in our popular imagination, right? Because in Night of the Living Dead, what's so interesting about this, it doesn't tell you how this happened. They give a couple theories, if you can remember, very, very short lines. And one of the theories was there was a space probe that went up and it crashed. So it's possibly from that, something was brought back on that. But at this point now, whenever we see these zombies, the undead unleashing themselves on humanity, it's quite possible that we are the cause of this, right? So
Absolutely.
so now we are dealing from going from one particular person and dealing with black magic to the idea that humanity now is bringing this plague upon themselves.
And do you find this is kind of a recurring theme with us from week to week? Because one of the things we often find at the heart underlying a lot of these myths is the human monster behind the mythical monster, and the way that some of these legends come to pass. I have a fun bit of trivia for you here. I think probably one of the most standard things that people think of when they think of zombies is everybody says brains, zombies eat brains. There's games called Zombies Ate My Brain and everything else, and it's kind of a common trope. There's a piece of trivia that I think is absolutely delightful, which is that particular concept came from one place and one place alone. And it's actually, I think, one of the best zombie films ever made. But before I tell you what the film is, I have to tell you another piece of trivia. So we got two trivia for the price of one. George Romero wrote the film, or directed the film, Night of the Living Dead. But unfortunately, due to some copyright issues, he ended up losing the copyright on the name Living Dead. So his successive films in the series, and there were several, couldn't use the term Living Dead. They actually ended up just being called Dead. In other words, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, etc., that were the follow-ups. The Living Dead term was copyright protected, and he lost it. But it didn't end the Living Dead movies. The owner of the copyright, the studio, did end up selling it off, and many other films got made. And in the late 1990s, a film got made that ended up being a huge success, and it was called Return of the Living Dead. This was the first official Living Dead film that followed up Night of the Living Dead 3 decades earlier. But this film is both a true horror film with plenty of gore in it, but also a very, very funny, dark comedy. It's got some hysterical performances, some really, really funny moments, but it also has the very first instance of zombies eating brains. In fact, it's specified in the film. The picture you see here of the sort of very skinny corpse-like zombie was referred to as Guitar Man, and he's the first zombie released in this film. And when he comes out, the first thing he says is brains. And it turns out that later on, when they get one of the main characters of the movie, a mortician, to examine one of the zombies, all she can do is basically chant brains, brains, brains. And he manages to get her to say that eating brains allows them to not feel the pain of death. It's a very dark concept. And essentially, this female zombie says that being dead hurts all the time, and the only thing that relieves it is eating brains. And so all these zombies want to do is eat brains. But that was the origin of that concept, which has become absolutely universal. I think it's hysterical to imagine that this very, very ubiquitous concept in zombie lore comes from a kind of a semi-obscure dark comedy from the 1990s, and yet now everybody takes it as simple fact about the zombie nightmare, I guess.
Yeah, it's a B movie at best, right? And
but it's a good B movie. It's great fun.
Yeah, it is great fun. But yeah, so George Romero has his goals, eating flesh, preying upon people, and now we have them deliberately now looking for brains. So
Correct.
we see it in 30 years now we have, but George Romero also set the rules on how you kill a zombie, right? You have to shoot them in the head. Yeah.
So it's interesting because, of course, that might have been why the script for Return of the Living Dead made brains so important, because in the George Romero films, it ended up being shown that the only way to destroy a zombie was essentially to destroy its brain. You either had to sever the spinal cord. By the way, folks, I know we're getting a little on the gory side, but it is a monster show, so hopefully you're not. But to sever the spinal cord or destroy the brain. So headshot with a gun, chopping the head off, these were the only ways to destroy the zombies in these films. And again, that was something that Romero created in his films, and that ended up becoming canon and is now considered the standard for almost all zombies. Now, they have evolved as time has gone on. We have, I think it was in the 1990s or early 2000s, remakes of several of these films got made, and somebody came up with the idea of what we call the fast zombie.
Oh, yeah.
I have to tell you that I always loved the shambling, slow zombie just because of the things we were talking about before. And it took me a long time to warm up to the idea of zombies that could run and could, sort of attack aggressively. But they can be mighty scary, and I've seen some incredibly frightening latter-day films that feature these fast zombies, and so I've warmed up to the idea since then. Although a good shambling, slow zombie still does it for me.
Well, the thing is, though, they're dead, so you would think that they would start having some sort of attributes of a dead person. Something, things are atrophying, they're going through rigor mortis and everything. But what's so interesting about the zombies that you pointed out, the fast zombies, like from 28 days later, is that again, these things aren't essentially dead, are they? Right? We are now moved up to the point where these are vessels for some sort of man-made disease that has escaped the confines of a facility. So these are completely different. They still need to attack. They still need to prey upon human beings, but we are now seeing an evolution in the zombie, and we're also seeing that they're playing by our rules now, right? The rules have now changed. This is what's so fascinating about the zombie. We can actually view the history. It's not like we're looking at, vampires or Bigfoot or anything like that. We have a very defined, definite timeline to look here, and we can see how quickly the evolution of the process of zombies has come.
It's true, and the fact that it's an evolutionary narrative, which many of these stories are, is true. But unlike so many of the great monsters of folklore, it's a narrative that evolved in a real timeline that we can track, and I think that's fascinating. When you look at vampires, it's hard to define where the vampire even originates in history, because the vampires have their precursors. They have, there's blood drinking demons and spirits and things that prey on life, and so there's a kind of a soft beginning of the vampire, and the vampire the way we know it today evolved very slowly and then was kind of crystallized by cinema. The same thing is true of werewolves and so many of these other creatures, but we can really track the zombie almost film to film and moment to moment from the time that the concept, the word zombie, was originated in Haitian culture into the flesh-eating zombies that we have today.
Right. And also what's going on in popular culture as well, too. That's the other unique thing about this.
Very much, and although it is true that certainly 1968's Night of the Living Dead was a groundbreaking film. By the way, it was cheap. It was a low budget indie film. It was incredibly cheap and incredibly successful, and not just successful in terms of audiences, but it had so much critical acclaim because the film had such a dark and smart tone to it. And I mentioned it when we very first talked about Night of the Living Dead, that the other big thing that happened when it came out was it was right in the heart of the civil rights movement.
Right.
And the fascinating thing about Night of the Living Dead is that this is a story about an intelligent, composed, resourceful black man who basically takes charge of a group of white survivors as they fend off these zombie attacks. And he is the black hero of this film. Now, in the next installment of George Romero's series, which took place, which was made 10 years later, Dawn of the Dead, we had the same thing happen. Now, Dawn of the Dead also has a small crew of heroes, but one of the most significant is, again, a resourceful, intelligent, very knowledgeable black man. And these two men end up becoming the heroes of Romero's series. And I think that there's a great deal of redemption in some ways in this, at least in terms of the Western zombie concept, because for the first time, Romero was saying that that this isn't a black magic that's coming here to destroy white people. In fact, in Romero's films, the zombies are almost all white people and very, very culturally white, which is something which is fascinating because much like Return of the Living Dead, which was several years later, was a social commentary, Dawn of the Dead is a truly cutting social commentary. I think one of the most fascinating moments in the movie is when Peter, the black character, he's the most significant black character in the film, when Peter says that these zombies, they basically hold up in a shopping mall, which I think you said you've been to in Pittsburgh, not all that far.
It's right down the road from me right now. Absolutely. Yeah, it's right. And what is so interesting about this is, and I don't want to steal your thunder because I know you're going to go on a different tangent, but the Monroeville Mall is what it's called, was one of the mega malls at the time. You know, by today's standards, it's a little bitty thing, but this movie, Dawn of the Dead, came about whenever malls were just starting to become popular.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is that the mall was sort of a brand new, shiny new sort of example of the glory of the Western world. But in many ways, it was seen by a lot of people as a sort of a temple to consumerism. And that's very much the idea behind Romero's film. And again, Peter, the character in the film, says in the film that zombies, of course, basically scratching at the door trying to get into this mall before they eventually break in, and he says that they don't even know why they're there. They just know it's important to their life, and the only thing that they want is to be in there. And there are so many scenes that just show these shambling sort of lifeless husks of people wandering through this mall, sort of pulling dresses on dummies and banging on the doors of stores. And the idea was, again, that these shells of human beings, the only instinct left in them was the instinct to shop. And as comical and almost silly as that sounds, it was a fascinating exploration of the idea of toxic consumerism. And I have to tell you that I had a great deal of fun coming up with this image here, because here we have a scene from a later zombie film and another scene of shoppers on Black Friday bursting through the door of a store, trampling displays, often trampling other people in their absolute consuming need to go and get the cheapest television or the latest phone. And that is a frightening thing, but it's something that many years before this before Black Friday even became a thing, that obviously Romero was keyed into the idea of this American consumerism that honestly was toxic even then.
Right. So if I need to go on my pulpit there for about 10 seconds, if I could. So what happens if people can remember back in the mid 70s, whenever malls first opened, every store, not like today, every store was filled, right? There was no vacancies. You know, people were clamoring to get in. So what happens then whenever the malls come up? Now the mom and pop stores close down, right? So what's going on with this kind of vision Romero is making is that the death of small town America is now taking place, right? So everything now think about it as Night of the Living Dead too. It's all small town. It's a little farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere, and people are gathered around a television set to find out what's going on. By the time we get to the Dawn of the Dead, small towns aren't even in existence anymore, right? Everything is focused upon the commercialism and in the cities, right? It's become urbanized now. And I think that's a great, it's a rather sad commentary on the way America is. But I think that's what's so good about Romero and what really makes him a genius in the work of horror movies. Even though the special effects can be kind of schlocky at times, and even though, maybe not the best acting, the point that he's trying to get through here is really groundbreaking in a lot of different ways.
I think it really was, and the fact that today we have not learned that lesson. The fact that today our sort of need for consumerism, even in the wake of, and this is something that we'll be talking about in a few moments, is a pandemic. Now, thankfully, the COVID pandemic didn't grow to the proportions that we often feared that it would. The death toll has been, at the very least, it's been limited. It certainly has not been an easy time, but even during the heart of this pandemic, when the idea of catching a potentially lethal disease, and if it wasn't lethal to you, that you could certainly pass on to somebody who was vulnerable, we felt that it should mitigate the way we behave, that it should mitigate our need to go out shopping or go to clubs and things like that. But for many, many people, it didn't. And that's what was terrifying. The idea is their need to be out there, their need to be on cruise ships, their need to be, to go to concerts and things like that completely overwhelmed their basic sense of self-preservation or sense of preservation of other people, preservation of their communities. And I think, unfortunately, the message that it sends about where we are as a species is a little bit terrifying. Now, you had mentioned a while ago, and we sort of briefly on the idea that zombie culture in modern times also can be related to things like drug use and addiction. And actually, I think one of the most frightening things that happened in the last decade, and I'm sure some of you will remember this, was what we affectionately referred to as the bath salt zombies. People so desperate to find an intoxicant were consuming commercially produced bath salts. And as a result, the madness, this kind of cannibalistic madness that resulted from it, turned people into living zombies. And in Florida, go figure, and apologize for Florida, but let's face it, you guys have some crazy stuff that goes on down there. We had a man who attacked another person, a naked man, high on bath salts, and literally chewed off the man's face. And this kind of stuff is terrifying because it wasn't a completely isolated incident. And the idea that a chemical, a simple chemical or an infection, could turn us from a rational human being into a cannibalistic, mindless killing machine, that is the absolute heart of the zombie legend. In fact, this story was so popular and certainly, seized the public imagination so much that it has made it into memes and even into films. Morton's bath salts there, that's a little bit on the terrifying side. And of course, bath salt zombies, drugs, sex, and cannibalism. So these things really, really absorb themselves into the public consciousness. And we do very much, we are so absorbed in the zombie mythology. We use the term zombie casually to refer to anyone who does something in a mindless way. We often refer to it from one political party or another to refer to the other people who we want to accuse somebody of basically mindlessly following a leader. And so we have absolutely absorbed and adopted the zombie as, in many ways, kind of the supernatural mascot of the 21st century. It's a terrifying thought. I think it's very true.
That's a great point. So in The Walking Dead, and I know that this line occurs in the graphic novel. I'm not sure about the television series or not, but whenever they were talking about the idea of the dead and everything, one of the characters says, "We are the Walking Dead," right? I mean, the living right there are the Walking Dead, and I think that is a great commentary because the zombies are essentially us, right? And if we look at the very beginning of this all, and the idea of them being programmed by an outside force like a witch doctor, Well, we are zombies now because we're being programmed by every kind of stimulus that's coming in our ears, right?
Social
Social
media,
media,
politics, everything.
everything, exactly right. So we have become zombies, and I think whenever people say, that person is a zombie, the commentary is just like you had said. We are allowing other people to program us, right? We are emptying ourselves and let other people's opinions fill us up. So we are the Walking Dead. We are those things that George Romero had warned us about, and what even the white zombie had tried to warn us about. We have become all of those things. We have become the catch-all for generations of misuse and all these other kind of anti racist commentary and everything. So we have become the 21st century zombies that carry with us this entire collective past. And what we're going to do with that is going to be the next stage in the progression of the zombie.
I like to think that we're going to be smart enough to sort of to grow out of it and learn the lessons that some of these films and some of these myths teach us. I'm not convinced that that's going to happen. I hate to be a cynic, but it is
Yeah.
hard sometimes to believe it. A couple last things that we want to cover. We did briefly mention an extraordinary film called 28 Days Later. 28 Days Later, one of the great modern zombie films that deals with the idea of zombification or zombieism being a pandemic, being actually caused by a virus that causes people to act in this way. And these movies really capitalize on our apocalypse fear. And we certainly learned that lesson, at least to a large degree. We saw how serious it can get with the stores stripped of goods and people basically hoarding supplies and things like that during the most recent pandemic. But maybe I think one of the most terrifying things that we've seen in the last couple of years, and we've certainly seen plenty of it in the US and abroad, is how similar we look to a zombie horde when we let political division and political absolutism corrupt us and turn us into animals, unfortunately. And so that does happen on both sides of the aisle. I'm not trying to pin, the cause on any one group of people, but we have to be better than this. I think we have to be better, or we will turn ourselves into these animals. And I think that unfortunately, that is something that is beginning to happen already. In fact, you said this, you paraphrased this a moment ago beautifully, but probably my very favorite line from the 1978 film Dawn of the Dead is when one of the characters asks, "What the hell are they?" Peter replies, "They're us."
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we're down to our last 3 minutes here. So we want to thank you all again for coming out and spending this hour with us and listening to us ramble on about these great zombies. Once again, I am Christopher Rondina, monster hunter, legend hunter, and author, and you can find my books online at www.ghostboypress.com.
And you are Christopher Rondina that's also going to be in England next week. So we're not going to have Monday Night Monsters next week. We're going to take a brief hiatus. But Chris is going to be going to Whitby over in England, and you're going to be bringing back so much fascinating vampire lore and pictures that as soon as we come back, so the week after next, our first show, whenever you come back from hiatus, will be on, look at that, on vampires. You already had a thumbnail created. And I'm really, because it's one of my favorite things to talk about.
So, ladies and gentlemen, again, just a reminder that we will not be here next week. So this our vampire show is going to be 2 weeks from tonight on Monday, May 9th. And hopefully, again, I will be coming back with some fun photos from my England trip. I'm going not just in search of Dracula, the most famous vampire ever to visit England, but also a wonderful legend from Northern England, which I'll share with you a little bit next week. Some great stuff. And as always, we want to thank you guys for joining us tonight. We also want to thank you for suggesting this topic. I think zombies was fascinating, and awesome. I think we had great fun tonight. And it was educational. There were so many different ideas here, and it ended up becoming a much richer topic than I ever imagined it could be.
Yep, I had a great time. But keep your bars on your windows and your brains to yourselves.
Absolutely. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, we're gonna head out tonight. Please join us in 2 weeks for our show on vampires. Thank you for coming. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you missed part of this broadcast. Of course, we are on Dead Air Full Spectrum on YouTube. You can watch this in just a little while. Subscribe, hit that like button. That helps us tremendous amount. The subscriptions help. And you can even hit the notification bell to get updates on the new shows when they come out so that you won't miss a single episode. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us, and we will see you in 2 weeks.